You have been telling a lot of lies to our people. You have projected yourself as an alternative government, and yet you want to denounce the notion of radical economic transformation. You are using black people as your voting voters. You do not represent the interest of our people. Thank you, House Chair.
Thank you very much. We now call on the Minister of Finance to conclude the report.
Take a bow, Honorable Mabe. Chairperson and honorable members, this is a debate about the fiscal framework, just in case we forget, and the revenue proposals. And let me make a few introductory comments in response to what Honorable Karim and others have contributed to this debate. And I want to thank the committee and the committee on the NCOP side for the good work that they've actually done. The first point that we need to make is that our fiscal strategy, which is reflected in the budget, is a very careful balancing act, as we've pointed out repeatedly, between revenue raising, expenditure cutting, borrowing carefully, and at the same time ensuring that we don't damage economic growth in a negative way, and continue with the processes of finding savings, but ensure that our budget remains essentially redistributive and is a symbol of social solidarity in South Africa and an expression of the support that the better off in South Africa give to the less well off in South Africa. And I think it's important in that context to remind Honorable Mania that debt shouldn't be made a bogey. Having debt is a normal thing in a household and for an individual, provided that you do it in a reasonable way and one understands the limits that one has to work with and has, as the rating agencies and our own investors would say, we have the ability to pay and the willingness to pay, something that South Africa has been able to demonstrate over the last 20 years of democracy, and nobody doubts our ability to pay and willingness to pay our debt. So be careful not to make it a bogey. Very few countries in the world survive without some level of debt or the other. The only question is how do we manage that? The second point we need to make is that without inclusive growth and the accompanying transformation of our economy and the participation of all of our people in our economy, we're not going to grow this economy. Excuse me. And if we don't grow this economy, we're not going to generate the revenue. If we don't generate the revenue, we're not going to create the fiscal capability that's required to meet either the support for the economy or continue with the social support that we've been giving to our own people over a period of time. And so I would recommend to all the parties here, let's really have a serious conversation on how do we get growth going. I think Honorable Shivambu has his ideas, but in doing so, let's also not specialize in slogans because that's not helpful. Let's talk about what will work given South Africa's history, which we should all actually admit is quite a divisive one and one which has created massive inequalities in our society and leaves the majority of our people behind. On the one hand, also understand our current context and what are the limits and the opportunities that we have, and how are we going to seize those opportunities through innovation, creativity, but above all, by building consensus amongst ourselves. Because if we don't do that, we won't get the radical economic transformation that we're asking for, nor are we going to actually meet the requirements of our people as well. The third and essential point around transformation is that transformation needs to be directed to the vast majority of our people in the lower classes, the working class, and the poor. They must be the principal beneficiaries. It's nice to have billionaires and millionaires, but the principal beneficiaries over the next 10 years must be our own people who find themselves in despair. And the real genius that we need to generate is how do we address their concerns, how do we increase wealth in their hands, how do we increase assets in their hands so that intergenerational poverty ends with our generation. That's the key challenge that we actually have amongst us. Now, related to growth is the question of private investment. A number of honorable members have addressed this question. But we're not going to get private investment if we keep battering people. You get private investment if firstly there's opportunities, secondly somebody's going to make a profit, and thirdly if we create the right level of confidence in the policy environment. And fourthly, create the national consensus that's required to generate the kind of optimism that our country is very capable of if we put our heads and our hearts together. Now, the choice we have is whether we continue to make negative noises, inverted commas, or we try to work across party lines and notwithstanding political and economic constraints that we have, try to meet some of the demands that we have on our society and create conditions for the private sector and indeed for the state itself to become a key investor in our economy. One of the appeals that I would like to make is that in our debates, Chairperson, we should not sacrifice a key principle or a set of principles, the Honorable Kekana would say, in our Constitution, that of non-sexism and non-racialism. We are tending towards moving towards creating greater divisions amongst ourselves, perceived or otherwise. I think let's focus on the issues before us and ask ourselves how do we work with each other in order to get some of these dynamics actually going. Honorable Karim, the Money Bills Act is actually a Parliament's act, and I hope that you and your committee and others in Parliament will bring about the changes that will make it more comfortable for committees to process the fiscal framework. Whilst we accept that we need to engage with the various stakeholders who made presentations to your committee, we must accept also, as you, I think, pointed out, that if you come with different paradigms and different philosophical outlooks, then we're going to have differences. And what I observe from what I've read of your report, we have too many traditionalists coming to the committee as well, putting forward traditional views as opposed to creative views that addresses the kind of concerns that we have in South Africa at this particular point in time. On the question of tax administration, you know, one of the things that we need to discourage is this idea that there's personality issues here. They're not. The very simple and fundamental constitutional issue here is that the head of an entity is accountable to a minister, end of story. And we need to make sure that we get the kind of accountability as the committee recommends in its report, including the manner in which we've generated huge concerns amongst the public about refunds, the way they manage, the way they're being held back, and whether this begins to influence the revenue numbers and the kind of confidence we can place in those numbers as well. But we will continue to work on some of those issues. On the question of a debt ceiling that the Honorable Mania proposes, some countries have them, some countries don't, some countries have created them and they've got rid of them, because as economic environments and dynamics change, our fiscal framework needs to be, on the one hand, providing certainty, but on the other hand, has to have an element of flexibility in it as well. And I think that's the balance that we are aiming for and have been aiming for as an ANC government for many years. On the question of not emphasizing fiscal drag, well, it's there. You know, South Africa is amongst the most transparent has amongst the most transparent budgets in the world. So I'm afraid, Honorable Mania, we're not hiding anything. It's a question of whether one wants to read about it or not. On the question of sale of non-core assets, I think it's very clear. If we are not growing the economy, if we're not generating the revenue that we require, we've got to mobilize revenue either from the sale of non-core assets and or get resources from other sectors of society that actually have them, and create the environment in which those resources actually create the dynamism that we require in the economy itself. On the question of whether we need an ad hoc committee, I leave that to Parliament to actually decide. Honorable Shivambu, I think the ideas that you have are interesting ones to debate. I'm not sure whether and how raising dividend tax to 40% or some of the other ideas that you have will begin to make an impact on some of the challenges that we have, but we will avail ourselves for the discourse that you speak of, and we would agree with your objectives that economic inclusion and participation on an urgent basis is something that all of us would actually agree with. Honorable Schlengwer, you make a very valid point that when we're going through periods of global turbulence and perhaps some level of inverted commas noise again in the South African context, it's important to keep the fiscal ship as steady as possible and to ensure that whilst we go through these political breezes and sometimes they might become gale force winds, we don't let the fiscal ship down and sacrifice the future of our own population in the process. On the question of corruption, a number of honorable members addressed that as well. And once again, unless we create a social movement in South Africa which pressures all of us to become more accountable about the way in which we either oversee the spending of public money or actually spend public money and hold both ourselves and our administrations to account, we're not going to make much progress in this particular regard. Honorable Shilembe, the budget speech is full of ideas on growth. The question is, how do we take ideas and make them practical? And how do we get implementation going in South Africa and create the conditions for that? And that's the challenge that I think we need to take up. Finally, Honorable Fultane's point about financial awareness campaigns is a very important one, and I hope that Parliament can agree on some kind of campaign with ourselves and other departments as well to generate far greater financial literacy amongst our population. Once again, thank you for your various thoughts, and you're welcome to come and debate those with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.